Hi, I'm Jamie Metzl, founder of OneShared.World, and it is my incredible pleasure to be here today with a real hero of mine, Arturo O'Farrell, who's an incredible pianist, composer, educator, the founder of the Afro Latino Jazz Alliance, and a professor of global jazz studies at UCLA, which I can only imagine is probably the best job in the world. And most importantly, he is the first OneShared.World Global Arts Ambassador, and we're really excited about that. But what I will say is that in preparing for this conversation this morning, I woke up and I was feeling a little sluggish. I was just back from an incredible trip in the fjords of Norway, and I was back in New York. I was a little jet lagged. I'm now writing my next book, and it's just terrifying to sit with a blank computer screen and think, all right, now I have to write a whole book. And how do I conjure something from nothing other than these ideas in my head? And so as part of preparing for this conversation, I thought, well, I'm just going to watch and listen to some of Arturo's music. And I watched this incredible performance at Columbia University of it was this incredible jazz with so much life and so much energy. And I just thought, well, what is music? It's these ideas that people have. It's people coming together with these ideas. It's people taking wood and plastic and metal and putting it together into these instruments of human creation, and then coming together to make something beautiful that finds our common humanity. And I thought maybe that's a kind of a nice transition to this connection between the incredible work that Arturo and others are doing to build the universal language of art and culture, and the work that we're trying to do with OneShared.World to say, how do we build a world? How do we look at the superstructure of a world where we can all come together, not just recognize our common humanity, but live lives that recognize our common humanity. So first to you, Arturo, welcome and thank you for this gift. But maybe we talked about this, you and I, when we met in person. If you could say a few words about how you see art, the language of art, as the common language of humanity.
Well, thank you, Jamie. Coming from you, those words are very, very profound. You are such a heavy yourself, and you've created this incredible gift for humanity called OneShared.World. So I'm so honored to be here, sitting with you and having this chat. The first thing that occurs to me is that music and art, but especially music, is really a migratory force. And in my life, I've made a career out of studying the transmission of elements of musical practice throughout the world, from the Middle East to Spain to the tip of Morocco to Western and Eastern Africa, then in the horrifying cataclysm called the slave trade, brought to what they call the New World. But guess what? There were indigenous people here. And then all that has become it's become to me such a beautiful reality that music is the ultimate global statement. That the music that Mozart wrote had its roots in Turkish, Spanish, Italian, French, German music. That people are realizing that you can't measure music in a metric. You can't put it in a little box and say, oh, this is jazz. Oh, this is Latin music. Oh, this is classical. None of that is acceptable anymore. So for me, artists are harbingers of globality. Artists are the ones who really understand that we share a small, tiny planet, and that we will survive based on our ability to embrace one another. I remember being 17 years old and getting on my first tour with Carla Bley, and getting to the departure lounge. And back then it was Pan Am. It was Pan Am, the flight, the global flight. I think it was Pan Am 1. I remember hearing people speaking German. We were on our way to Berlin. And I remember feeling so unbelievably privileged to share in the world, to go to a different place and to not see people as different, but to understand that German mothers had to take their German kids to school, that South African fathers have to take their South African children to school, that Korean parents fight, and that Mexican parents have to raise their kids. I mean, that we all share the humanity. This vehicle, this thing that we all share is what unites us. And anybody who wants to stratify the world into nation states is absolutely bonkers. And unfortunately, as you know, so much of what is going wrong today in our nation is people who want to just isolate themselves from the rest of the planet. It's horrifying. It's horrifying.
Yeah, it's such a profound point that you make, that there's different musics and different traditions in different parts of the world. But for longer than most of us appreciate, we've been bumping into each other, learning from each other, growing from each other. And so even these things that we call just our own, when we look at them, are in fact borrowings. And we are in a constant state of borrowing, and we're in a constant state of lending. OneShared.World was founded in the earliest days of the pandemic, because if there's one symbol that, at least in addition to the art and culture sharing, it's a global pandemic. These pathogens don't care about our boundaries and borders, but it's really just everything. I mean, a friend of mine wrote a book about going to a coffee shop in New York, and his little son asked him where the coffee comes from. And so he thought about, well, where does the coffee come from? Where does the cup come from? Who painted the line on the road in Colombia so that the truck drivers could get the beans to the airport? And it turned out, when he made a list of all the people who had played a role in just delivering his morning cup of coffee, it was many, many thousands of people, if not more. And so he spent a year traveling around the world, thanking each one of these people for this contribution. And they were just kind of shocked, because no one had ever thanked them. But two, no one had ever thought about what all of these connections are. And so I fully agree with you that music is the language of our common humanity. It comes in many ways from something that's just very deep in our souls. And yet, for all of us who have this universal message of our common humanity, we keep bumping into these boundaries and borders that have been created, some of them for good reason. I mean, the nation state exists for historical reasons. And as we're seeing in Ukraine, sometimes it's worth defending that principle. But in many other cases, we have forms of organization that are overly centralized around ideas of us and them. Whereas if we just recognized the us and us, we could do a lot more. And so with that realization as our common foundation, maybe Arturo, if you could talk a little bit about how you see the active role of art and culture in bridging that divide. What specific responsibilities do artists have? What specific roles can they play in inspiring us all to see that better part of ourselves?
Well, it's so funny that you say this, because I understand borders, and I understand nation state, and I understand the need for these concepts. I think you hit on something really important, though, that despite those necessary constructs, we need to understand the things that hold us together. And the reason I think art is such a powerful way to do this is because I often travel. I travel all over the world. And wherever I go, I realize people that I feel at home. And that's so weird to me. And it's so weird to me that I feel at home in Seoul, Korea, that I feel at home in San Sebastian, Spain. It's so weird to me that I feel at home everywhere I go. And I realize it's because the music is taking me there. And the music that I share with people seems to hold us together and seems to remind us and again, I have to say that one of the most amazing things that I learned, there's a book that talks about music, all the popular music that we love, all the hip hop and jazz and salsa and Latin music and all the contemporary popular music that we enjoy is really born out of very specific religious rhythms in Africa. And so in some ways, when we share this culture, we're actually experiencing religion the culture of love, the culture of understanding that this is the way we communicate in a more profound way. This is music and art does that. People get it. I remembered being 10 years old. This is the kind of artist I hope to be. I remember being 10 years old and going on a school trip to MoMA, where Guernica was on loan. And I remember looking at this painting. I knew nothing about fascism. I knew nothing about Europe. I knew nothing about Spain. I knew nothing about Franco. I wept like a child. I saw the severed head of the horse, and I had no knowledge of violence. And that's what art does, man. Art brings messages that you could not possibly really have in your heart and plants them there. And I really believe that it was at that moment that I decided I was going to do something to change the world. And I would do something. Whatever I do, I really believe I was 10 years old and I went, nah, I can't, I'm not going to be part of that.
Wow.
That's how artists change the world.
Yeah. And you've done it in very, very practical ways. So I want to share with our viewers this incredible work that you've done called Fandango at the Wall. We'll just see a little short excerpt from it, and then you and I will come back just after to talk about it. Amor sin fronteras, amor es love.
This all began when I read about a librarian who started a music festival at the border between the United States and Mexico. ¡Que viva México! He invited us to join him to sing, perform, and dance. And that wall built to divide us was transformed into something that unites us. I fell in love with this idea of people coming together using the primal connection of a Mexican folk music called son jarocho. Despierta, patria, despierta. Despierta, patria, despierta. This is not just a story. It's a vision of a world full of hope, friendship, and love.
Great. So incredible work, Arturo. Tell us about that work and your experience around it and your lessons and what are the takeaways from this experience about how we can use art and culture to help build a safer, better, stronger, more respectful world for everyone.
You know, I read an article about Jorge Francisco Castillo, who is the founder of Fandango Fronterizo, which is the festival where artists, musicians are brought to perform at either side of the wall between San Isidro and Tijuana. And this article moved me. I thought it was such elegant artivism. I thought making a statement using chicken wire and fencing and automatic weapons and patrol dogs and armed guards to using the very elements of hatred and oppression to build community, to state love, to literally bend time and matter and space and deny the hatred and the oppression was, I thought, the most elegant artivism. And so I took this idea to my dear friend Kabir Segal, and we decided we were going to do a project. So that project became a recording, which became a book, which became a documentary. And the takeaway for me from that whole project is that the music of son jarocho is a perfect picture of the migratory force of music. because the enslaved peoples were not allowed to keep their instruments when they were brought to Mexico. In fact, that's called Afro-Mexican music. And so a lot of the things that go for that constitute African musical practice, the striation of rhythmic elements, was instead of played on drums, instead of played on congas and cowbells and whatever, and it was striated into these guitars called jaranas, which, if you really think about, all guitars are related to the vihuela in Spain, which is related to the oud in the Middle East. And so you have these Africanized rhythm patterns that are played on guitars that are, and also the call and response, the declamatory singing. Son Jarocho music, to me, became a picture of the migratory power of music, how it came through the Middle East, maybe South Asia, to Spain, to tip of Africa, made its way to Mexico, where in the hands of Mexicans. Here's the thing that I really learned about Son Jarocho music. Son Jarocho is globally informed, comes from all over the world through Mother Africa. And yet, in the hands of these Mexican performers, it is quintessentially Mexican. And so what I learned is that we actually don't dilute ourselves by embracing the global source of information that constitutes culture. We actually become more ourselves. We become more ourselves when we embrace the source of all of so like your friend did. He traced the path of a coffee and of a coffee cup, and learned that we have relations with people all over the planet. And for me, the music of Son Jarocho, actually, almost all the music I play. We just did a concert in Little Island Park called Cuba Meets Calidri, the Middle Eastern roots of Afro-Cuban jazz. And we had performers from Kuwait, from Fujairah, from Abu Dhabi, from Morocco, from Bahrain. We had these people on stage sharing in the experience that we call jazz. Now, jazz is just an entry point word. Jazz is an entry point word into a much larger conversation. But the truth of the matter is that there was so much crazy, mad love and respect on that stage that it just affirmed again to me this thing that I must have learned as a young musician, that the music I play is informed by sources that I couldn't even imagine. And I think that's how we take our message to others.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important point. For those of us who think of ourselves as globalists, there's a cliche, oh, the globalists, they're against the nation state, they're against all these local things. But I totally agree with you. I mean, we can all be really great versions of our community, whatever that is, and really love our community and want to preserve the unique identity of our community, while recognizing that our community exists within a much bigger context. And so with OneShared.World, our message is not, for example, national leaders should just forget national interests and just say, well, everything is about global common interest. What we're just saying is we need to find the right balance between our identities as individuals, as members of small communities, as members of larger communities, and as members of global communities. And nobody has the right answer, but we need to think about that balancing.
It's interesting because I think the best argument you can make for nation states is that different geographic territories require different governance just by physicality. And so what works for the nation of India is not going to work for the nation of Panama. And so there's got to be specific governance and structures of power in place. And so there is absolute need for nation state. But what I think is beautiful about OneShared.World is that we understand that those structures are to aid one another, to aid the people in. Well, listen, I live in Brooklyn. I'm going to tell you now. There, outside my block is Hasidic, Muslim, West Indian, young, old, green, red, gay, straight, everything. And man, I love that. But that's because it's Brooklyn. That little slice of Brooklyn is so perfect for me because I need to see that diversity. That might not work somewhere else, but that's okay because I know and understand that that's who I am. That's what I do. That's how I live. And I think it's important for everyone to be allowed to live the best lives they can live. And one of those things is allowing people to govern themselves. So yes, the nation state is very important. But what is not so important is to determine that your nation state is more important than my nation state.
And also like we were saying before, we all have ways of constructing our identities. I'm this, I'm that. And it's part of being human. But the more awareness that we can have to our interconnectivity, to how we're all part of some things that we know, and we're part of some things that we don't know. And in our view of OneShared.World, I know your view as an artist, is that if we can just plug in a little more to our own consciousness, to our own awareness of how connected we are to other people, when making decisions, we'll get out, as I said before, of this solely or primarily us versus them paradigm, and say, well, what is the us, not versus us and us? And that's again why your work and the work of artists like you is such a poignant reminder. Like I just had this morning, it was like I wasn't even I didn't have the words. It was just this experience as I was drinking my hot chocolate. It's like, oh yeah, I'm part of something bigger. And maybe it's something that we can articulate, or maybe it's just something deep within our consciousness, a rhythm, a beat that is part of being a human being. And so I'll give you the last word before we drop off, but in your esteemed role as Global Arts Ambassador of OneShared.World, and your wonderful message as a truly, I will say a global artist, but also a local artist who's working to preserve this wonderful, magical, hybrid tradition of Afro Latin jazz. What's your message to the many people who will be watching this and thinking about the role that arts and culture can play in our lives?
That's a simple one, because it goes back to the dictum, think global, act local. It just goes back to the dictum that we can't change the world unless we're willing to embrace the neighbor across the hall. And that's a simple reality. I have in my capacity and my privilege to be at UCLA, the ability to talk to young people, and they're looking for direction in their lives. I'll never forget a young man who texted me in the middle of the night having a crisis and said, I don't know what to do with my art. I want to save the world. And I looked at him and I said, you know what you got to do? You got to find some kids that need a saxophone lesson in your block, you maybe even within sight. Or other than that, you can also visit a nursing home and play for senior citizens. You start with one step. You take one step towards helping another human being, and by God, it's contagious. I'm telling you, I began the Afro Latin Jazz Lines with my wife on our kitchen table, taping parts for concerts and buying cookies and water for rehearsals. Here we are 15 years later. We've just been awarded a substantial sum by the city of New York to build a performing arts center in the hood in Spanish Harlem. One step. You put on one concert, you talk to one person, you reach out across the hallway to your neighbor, across the yard to your neighbor. That's what you do. You just go, think global, act local, move your feet, go across the street and talk to somebody. Help somebody in your block. That's the way that I think you best serve humanity.
Just wonderful. OneShared.World begins with a single step. Arturo, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure sharing this time with you.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you for the honor and the privilege of being part of OneShared.World and to be able to speak to you and so many folks.